My name is Isherwood. I'm an attorney with the Sierra Club, where I've worked for the past 14 years, and I've spent about the past 7 years or so focusing on mountaintop removal, coal mining in Appalachia, and that's what our workshop is about today. We have a variety of speakers that I'm really excited about, and I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience who have a lot to bring to this discussion as well, and we hope to make this as interactive as we can. We have 2 hours for this. This will go a full 2 hours. We certainly don't want to just talk at you for 2 hours, so we'll try to make it as entertaining as we can, and hopefully it'll be interactive, and we'll see how that goes. We at the Sierra Club and all of our allies employ a wide variety of tactics that win over hearts and minds, from lawsuits and protests and cattle prods to the use of the arts, one of my favorite tactics to win over hearts and minds. And we've had a lot of help in that regard from a lot of folks like the Beehive Collective, who's done an amazing poster that tells the story of mountaintop removal mining, to a lot of musicians who've written songs about it, to a lot of filmmakers, including Mary Lynn Evans, who's about to come out with a new film that will debut in Charleston called Blood on the Mountain on October 26th. And Mary Lynn's been working with a number of musicians on the new film, including Tim O'Brien and Daryl Scott, who just written a new song, and Mary Lynn put some images to it. And if it works out, we're going to start out today by showing that. I'm completely worthless when it comes to the technology, so I'm hoping these youngsters over here might be able to figure it out.
I think I skipped that generation.
No?
Keep talking, Harry.
Okay.
There,
Keep talking.
I got it.
I can do that. I'm a lawyer. All right, so we are going to ask that you hold your questions. We're going to try to leave 30 minutes at the end for discussion and questions. But we have a lot of people who want to present and a lot to tell you about. So if you can, try to hold your questions.
Well, my daddy came from coal. Me, I'm about the same. If you read King Cole's lecture book, then you've seen my family name. It used to take a camp of miners to load their trading gold. Now this boy and my crew, we do what we do to keep your dirty lights on. Keep your dirty lights on. Yeah, keep your dirty lights on. If you got King Cole and Honey, switch on. You've seen my family dirty lights on. Take a camp of
Well, Daddy worked in darkness, me in broad daylight. Hot and blue seemed like Daddy never dreamed. Using no bells, dynamite. As long as it's cool in them mountains, we're gonna burn it up till it's gone. Well, we can't stop blowing mountaintops. We gotta keep your dirty lights on. Yeah, keep your dirty lights on. Keep your dirty lights on. If you got money in your pocket and a switch on the wall, we'll keep your dirty lights on. Yeah.
Every time they have elections, they talk how coal is clean. Well, coal is cheap, but coal's still black. It ain't never turning green. So plug your electric
Go, go, go.
car in.
charge it good and strong. And do your shopping online will get you every time. Just to keep your dirty lights on. Keep your dirty lights on. Keep your dirty lights on. If you
Yeah.
got money in your pocket and a switch on the wall, you keep your dirty lights on. Keep your dirty lights on. Keep your dirty lights on.
That's good. That's good. I get something. All right. So this workshop is about mountain residents working with nonprofits and attorneys to fight mountaintop removal mining and winning. The struggle against mountaintop removal is a story filled with sadness and tragedy, but it's also a story of hope, inspiration, and triumph. The environmental destruction caused by mountaintop removal is almost unfathomable. If you fly up in a small aircraft above the mountains of West Virginia, Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, and East Tennessee, you see the remnants of one of the oldest and most biologically diverse mountain ranges on Earth. But where there were once forested mountain ridges and healthy streams brimming with fish and wildlife, now you see large areas of barren, lifeless moonscape, cratered with giant toxic sludge ponds, river valleys buried in mining waste, and streams devoid of life. But what's even more tragic than the impacts to the environment are the impacts to the communities that live in these areas where this mining is taking place. You've got giant corporate landholding companies that own most of the land in these areas, and they lease their land to the coal companies at huge profits at the expense of the communities and their entire culture. Mountaintop removal mining employs a lot fewer people than traditional deep mining, and so it's displaced a lot of workers. And basically the upshot is that a lot of, there really are not job opportunities in these communities. Your choice is you work for the coal industry or you leave. So a lot of people, generations long families have fled the area, and those who stay, and that's exactly how the coal industry wants it. They want it so that there's really no option. And those who stay have to cope with the horrors of mountaintop removal. And so the impacts to communities include, today you'll hear first-hand accounts of how mountaintop removal mining affects people. You'll hear about blasting and coal dust ruining people's lives and endangering their health. You'll hear about mining waste poisoning wells and public drinking water supplies, corrupt politicians and agency officials who care more about protecting the coal industry profits than people. This is, as I said, not just a story of sadness and tragedy, though. It's also a story of hope, inspiration, and triumph. It's a real David and Goliath story of ordinary people fighting to protect their communities and their entire way of life from powerful evil forces. And it's about mountain people who have banded together with lawyers and nonprofits to take on the once all-powerful coal industry and win. And the real heroes of this struggle are the people who live with this every day in these communities. And they are courageously standing up to the powerful coal industry, often at great personal risk. And we are extremely privileged today to have a couple of community members with us today from East Tennessee. And so I'd like to introduce Carol, Judy, and Vicki Terry.
I first became aware of mountaintop removal. Can we shift everything? Table in front of me too.
No, we get
Security blanket.
Donnie Yens, come over here and join us too, please.
Well, okay, when I first became aware of mountaintop removal, I had no idea what they were doing, and it just, it just didn't make sense. It was this beautiful mountain being blown up. And as I became aware of it, I want to first thank the organizations, SOCM and Mountain Justice and Sierra Club, because without these organizations, I doubt I could have done anything to protected our community. And I also want to mention, I was scared to say anything in our own community because I just heard horror stories, people getting burned out, shot at, etc., or animals killed. So I always concentrated in lobbying for the Clean Water Protection Act in D.C. and spent most of my time in West Virginia helping them figure the process that's open in other areas that's going through it already has been devastated. And it's just terrible. I mean, it's just devastating. There's just no other word for it. And I've seen how it affects people. I met one old woman, Dorothy, from Appalachia, Virginia, and she's the sweetest woman. She's still fighting this cause, and she's done lost the fight, her personal fight. When I first met her, her foundation of her house was cracking, and a couple years ago, she'd seen her, and she said it was the bottom of a sludge pond. It wasn't just her house; it was her rose garden, her clothesline. It was her home. And she was like one of my heroes, so she keeps me kind of motivated. If she can still keep doing this, I can. But right now we are facing over 1,000 acres of Sterling Stray Mines, Apollo, over 1,500 acres Cooper Ridge, 500 acres Clear Fork surface mining, with 3 new permits in our area, plus we're facing a coal ash landfill at 300 acres in our community also. And all that together pretty much at the same time. And so now I'm having to speak up in my own community because I do not want us looking like West Virginia and Kentucky. It's just, we won't be able to live there. I don't see how we could, because that would pretty much take our community away. And like I said, the organizations are very important to us in helping us in this fight, protecting our water and our homes and our culture, etc. But I think it's neat that we have so many lawyers that's willing to help us. We sure need the lawyers.
I'm Carol, Judy, and Vicki and I both live in the same community. And I want to give y'all a perspective of what we in Community of Place do sometimes. It's called long-term planning. I'll bet you everyone have heard that word, haven't you? Long-term planning. Where I began was in 1984. 34, decided I learned learning. So up till today, which is 2013, during this time I have helped create a community land trust, Woodland Community Land Trust. I've also been part of political actions nationally and locally. And I say all this because in 1984, as a welfare mommy, I needed a way to take care of my 2 kids. And somewhere along the journey through the arts and the culture of them praise of mountain women, neighborhood women, I learned that maybe I wasn't the one that was broken. That maybe it was the system that was broken. I still think that. And I think that in this journey of learning things today for the past 10 years, I have worked with the most amazing people in the world. And I call them the rising generation. Because they love these mountains as much as I do, and as much as Vicki does. They weren't birthed there, I wasn't birthed there. I have a granddaddy birthed there. But they love these mountains as much as we do. And they're willing to challenge the myth of the status quo within the United States for justice. For 10 years, young people have been visiting my community specifically to listen to stories from people in the community of place. And in that same 10 years, we have also learned to listen to the others because we had ACE, Appalachian Community Economics Conference, that pulled us together. 2 years of planning collectively, which culminated in a wonderful event. And we now have Tennessee ACE part of it. And Mountain Justice, young people have been there steady along the way. And amazingly enough, they found ways to stay in the communities of place instead of the myth of move up and out and up into a corporate world. They understood that, but they also understood corporate needed a different reality grip, perhaps. So, and in my community of place, we've had to match the same journey because we have young people who fall through the gaps. We have educational issues. We have persistent poverty issues. We're one of the 4 in the United States of persistent, systemic, persistent poverty. And guess what? They all have in common, votes, absentee land ownership, control of the rural resources that are required for people to have a rural reality. I chose education as the field to begin to cross all the boundaries because education seems to be the arena that should invite diversity, should celebrate it as a matter of fact, and uplift it. And it has for me. So right now in 2013, we have the Clear Fork Community Institute in my community. And it represents education. Education that will cross boundaries and enable us to learn to ask questions, to find our own solutions, to promote our own solutions. Because during this time in the Clear Fork Valley, we have created a public water utility. Okay, I'm dyslexic and can't spell. Spell check. You never saw anybody love spell check so much I could crash a spell check program in a heartbeat sometimes. But, you know, my community is still alive. We've created clinics. We've created a community land trust, community development corporate, CDC's Community Development Corporation. We've done a lot in 40 years about trying to figure out our own solutions. They are not politically acceptable, of course, you know that, right? Politically acceptable nationally also. Sometimes our solutions are not politically accepted locally either. I'm sure you've all have run across that somewhere down the line.
Carol, can you explain, like, geographically where this community is, for people who maybe have never been to the Clear Fork Valley? Where are you at? Why is it an important region?
This is Middlesboro, Kentucky. This is La Follette. Knoxville is down here, but this is La Follette. This is Jellicoe, Tennessee. And CCI, or Clear Fork Valley, is there. We have the major highways. So this is Middlesboro, Kentucky. We have Bell and Whitley County. And we have Campbell and Claiborne. In CLAIRBOURN in Tennessee. Okay. So, and they're all incorporated. Some of the data statistics, if you would like, is 80% of the land is owned by absentee corporations. The latest political type is multinational corporations, I think. John Gaventa, Power and Powerlessness. I ain't read it, but we're in it. You know, I'm gonna read it one day. They told me to skip the first chapter, then I'd get over being pissed off and read something meaningful. That's why I was told I figure I will. So we are, I think that the one thing that my community of place has that makes us different than a lot of others is when we look at collective organizations. We had a woman come to my community who was a member of FOCUS. FOCUS stands for Federations of Communities in Service. This was a bunch of radical nuns who come out of the convent and form their own organization. Anywhere there's a FOCUS woman, that community's going to look different, I guarantee you that. And she came asking questions, not for solutions. So that's one reason my community looks different. The other was that there was a concentrated effort to enable people in the community of place to believe in themselves. "40 years, folks. We've done a lot. Got more to do. Education for me is the arena. What kind of laws do we need? We need laws that will enable rural people to be able to take care of the community of place because these mountains are your watersheds. 80% of the world's water, potable, tastable, drinkable, living water is produced by mountains. It makes no sense to take the mountains apart to it. You know it destroys our watershed and our health. The statistics are there. ilovemountains.org. Just go there and look at the health statistics and know that that represents our people. You know, my great-granddaddy, my children's great-great-granddaddies, you know, that's your cousin. Big families. Those statistics really, really do have to win faces and names, whether we know them or not. And to know that we are not calling for a moratorium on something that is going to affect you, the rising generation, much longer than it is me. Y'all need to stand up and holler loud. That's what I think about the water. I surely do. But I think that our young people at the same time, we need to continue with our education because we need to know more also. I am a non-timber forest worker also. That means I go out in the mountains and dig roots. Anybody don't know what digging roots is? Raise your hand, I'll tell you.
Well, I don't.
Digging roots is a cultural tradition in Appalachia. And most people think about ginseng. So you've always heard the stories about people taking things from the woods and taking it to a marketplace. Well, it turns out that ginseng is only one of over 1,000 medicinal and culinary herbs in our Middle Tennessee region. We're a temperate rainforest. Gee golly. That means we got lots of diversity. You know, and most of that, so these non-timber products involve me going out in the mountains and digging roots. And I like to dig yellow root the best because I can sit in a mountainside and I can sit there and I can look around and dig and make a little money and learn. So that's what I like to do. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of young people that are out there. You know, we can sit and talk. I haven't figured out how to like the loud music they like now. And I don't make it to the church of four walls too often either, so I have limited access to young people. So to find them in the woods is really wonderful because then they go back to the Institute with me usually. They have. We host college groups at the Institute. So what we've done, or what I've tried to do, is build a network between young people, but educating ourselves, our own young people, to find our own voice, to be able to ask questions, to offer our opinion, not to take offense because we heard something wrong. It's leadership skills development languages. I don't know why they don't teach it in school. Seems like they ought to, along with some more arts. We believe, I think that collectively in my community a place where we ultimately believe in the ultimate good of individuals. And that might be because that's the way we are, or we want to be. But what I know is that I've got great grandkids that are 2 and 3, and that I want their world to have a different reality than what is in place for them through mountaintop removal. We needed different jobs before the environmental concerns have been raised to the level they are now as a human society. We needed something different because money poor does not mean brain dead, nor does it mean that we're the most intelligent people either. It just simply means that there's a system that hasn't functioned well for us. And that's a proven fact if you look at the escalation of what it takes to be below the poverty line. We got lots of smart folks. We've got folks that went to college. We've got folks that, you know, pursued an interest. There's a lot of us that can be defined that way, and our knowledge can be meshed to enable us to reintroduce into our society an element of movement, of culture called tribal. That education has to become more of a mesh between the realities of the written word and a person's ability to relate to that written. Our young people need to be able to find each other and converse with each other and clarify with each other so that they can indeed figure out where culture and society needs to fit in a 250-year forest management plan, thank you. And education's about 15 years of that maybe, from like 15 to 30 is movement. I figured that if we create the products from the roots, did I mention that non-timber forest products is a $40 billion a year industry? Global? That don't sound a lot like peanuts to me. I want to know why we're letting the mountains be took apart when you got all that potential there. I want to know why we aren't doing more of the value added with those products, even with the small ones like that, just as all the coal, gas, oil, and timber goes out, and it comes back as a finished product, which you probably can't afford. Are we going to replicate that with non-timber products? I hope not. I don't plan on it happening. I plan on keeping on teaching young people what they need to know to be able to find solutions. Young people of my community of placing young people that are called by the mountains. Because that's the other element of what it's going to take to make systemic changes of belief. Whether it's and it has to be a belief that's tickled by the arts, because that introduces potentials beyond anything you'll ever know. And some people will call it spiritual, and I would totally agree with that. But I won't agree that it's institutionalized religion.
Ms. Carroll, if you can give us some few more wrap-up words, and then we're going to hear about the landscape of what's happening in other states.
I want y'all to know that I built off of Vicky's word when I talked about the organizations that I did, because it does indeed take a whole cultural mix to help people be able to define who they are rather than always be defined by others. It is indeed a tribute to American society that we do have the Sierra, that we have people that are concerned about clean waters and clean water rivers and all of the other groups, that young people come together, SOCM, and its longevity as a community, but it does take a collective. We don't have all of them created yet. We have the options to create them, or add, or if they exist somewhere, as my training is, to know as a place-based development educator. Something is already working. How do you connect that to what you're already doing? And supporting grassroots efforts is money, but it's so much more than money also, because the economy is more than money. Thank you.
Now, you hear these stories throughout, I hear these stories everywhere I go throughout the mountain communities in Appalachia, and whether it's East Tennessee or Kentucky, East Kentucky, or South Virginia or West Virginia, you'll hear the same stories, and I think there's probably some others in the room, and I wonder if any of you would like to share your stories, maybe Donna, for instance, about what's going on in West Virginia.
I live in Mingo County, West Virginia. That's the southern part. We're supposed to be the home of the $1 trillion coal field. My county is very, very poor, so I'd like to know where that $1 trillion went to. Right now, we're seeing a lot of application for new mountaintop mining permits. I think it's because the mining industry may be thinking that there will be a moratorium on the permitting process or whatever. I can tell you my personal story, how I got involved with mountaintop removal. I was raised in a coal camp. About 1.5 miles down from my house was a tipple where they loaded out coal that come from the underground. My dad worked at that tipple for 39 years. So did his brothers. And that particular hollow that we lived in, my dad's family had been there for like 6 generations, so everybody in that community was kin. And all his brothers and my mom's brothers worked in that particular mine. In the late, I think it was 1980, they shut the underground mine down with my dad and most of his brothers was able to retire them. And we were really happy because we thought we was going to get rid of the coal dust. And it is true that coal dust will get in your refrigerator. You know how tight your refrigerator seals. Well, if you live within a loadout or a tipple or somewhere where they do mountaintop removal or any kind of disturbance of the soil, it can get in your refrigerator, it gets in your hair, it gets in your nose, it's everywhere. So by that time, most of us children, had moved out, on with their lives, and their parents stayed there. And in '81, they started doing what they called strip mining. Strip mining called in at the same tipple, except going underground with flowing off the top of the mountain. Like I say, it was only like a mile roadway, to people's homes, and air miles was even less. They would do such loud blasting, they were cracking the foundation of the homes were there. The roofs were leaking. My parents' chimney and our neighbor's chimney come that far away from the house because of this blasting. And the water got contaminated. The mines did come out and drill everybody a new deep well, but then it went dry because it broke the aquifers. Life just got so hard for people up there that they were talking about selling out, and it was Hobeck Mining Company. That was the people that had the operation. The turning point for all of my father's people and my people was one evening my dad was getting out of the bathtub. He had a heart condition. And they let the most enormous blast off ever was. I mean, it shook the house. The plates fell out of the cabinets. And he had a heart attack. So the community got together and they decided, because the coal company had been trying to make them sell out to him anyway for like 3 years, that they was just going to have to move because it was having to pack the water that the mines could bring in would be contaminated. They just put in these big plastic things outside and you could see everything in it. If you mentioned it to them, they just bring it down to Clorox and pour it in there. So anyway, to make a long story short, the family moved. And in West Virginia, there's really not a whole big lot of flat land, or there wasn't an area where the family could all move together. So that's scattered. Great aunts, great uncles, grandmas, grandpas, cousins, just scattered all over Mingo and Logan County. So that was a hardship on the family. One of the worst things was, my mom lived a year after that. I held her head in my lap while she was dying, while she was crying to go back home. Home wasn't where she moved to. Home was up 22nd home. That's where she wanted to be when she died. And I just thought that was such a bad injustice that they done to my people. Yeah, my dad worked in that mines and he drew a paycheck, but I also watched him suffer for the last breath that he could draw because of black money that he suffered from the mine. Make matters worse, my husband was a coal miner. And he would tell you today if he was here that the, I forget what they're called anyways, things that the men carry around that's supposed to check the air quality. Well, they take the guts out of that before the men put them on and carry it. You know, so there's no reading from that. I mean, it's just been all that injustice. And even after all that, I was so naive that whenever we moved back here, you know, we thought we was going to move to an area where they wasn't going to do anything. And the first time that they had a permit proposed that I thought would impact me, of course I wrote my little letter, you know, basically just give them a comment, sent it to the West Virginia DEP. And I got a letter back in stating that there would be no way that they could harm me, blah, blah, blah. Well, I sort of knew better, so I asked for a hearing for the surface mine. And I was so naive that I thought you could just go in and tell them what, you know, to have you come in. What? You know, my parents didn't miss it down, my neighbors, da, 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 da. They didn't care. They ate me alive and spit me out. And I thought, my God, they're not going to do me that way no more. I'm going to find something. So I just kept calling around until I found some of these good organizations. OVIC, Sierra Club, Christians for the Mountains, all of the mountains, at Voice. And one thing led to another. And I have been in this since 1993, writing letters and stuff. I can see that we've taken baby steps, and when we do take a baby step, I have a good celebration because it took years to even get a baby step. There's no way you're ever going to mine coal, whether it's deep mine or mountaintop, and move what's going to be clean. Coal is not clean. The only people that get money from that is the coal barons. Mountaintop removal does take the underground mining job. And because of my activities against the coal, I pay a pretty heavy price in the county I lived in. It's hard for me to go grocery shopping without, you know, people saying things to me. The coal company, you know, how they have people coming to fish the creek's water. Well, I could let them come on my property because they was leaving my gates open, my horses would get out, you know, my chickens, they were just real disruptive to my land. So 2 years ago this month, where the water testers thought that we were gone. And he came in on my property and killed my turkey that was on my porch stand. He had this big long antenna on his truck and it's got a little flag on it so they can see where they're at in the strip line. He was punching the other one on the porch and there's just blood and feces all over the place. So I thought, I got him. I took him to court, he got fined $15. And he shot the turkey with the Glock 9. My grandson was in my house. Now, what if he'd opened that door was stone that time? But that didn't make it no better. And every day I have to fight to keep them off my land. I have 113 acres. I have my water tested because the creek runs through it that I use, you know, for my animals and stuff in water. I have to have that tested quite a bit. And I've learned a lot of times I take standing for a lot of the organizations that's found out that some of the old mining sites is being contaminated with selenium and other poison. I take standing in court for that. And every once in a while, like I said, we do get baby steps, but it's few and far in between. And every time I come to one of these conferences, I do get energized because I do see new faces. I see older faces still I've been before. And it's good. It's good, I think, as long as we keep on keeping on. We'll end up getting there, but we can't ever let our heart down. And we do need to educate our young people. Treat them with respect. They can holler louder than we can.
Thank you so much, Donna. I wonder if there are any others in the room who live in mountain communities being impacted by mountaintop removal who would like to share their stories. Well, I'm going to share one with you. I first took my first trip working for the Sierra Club to Appalachia. I was invited to come by one of our organizers. I'm going to confess something. Organizers tend not to like lawyers very much. We tend to, from their perspective, we come in and say, we're going to save all of you from this problem. You don't have to do anything. We're just going to sue them and just sit back and we're going to save you. And it takes all the power out of the community, and guess what? The lawyers don't save them, and then they leave. And, so when I first called, we had two organizers at the time, one in West Virginia and one in the southwest corner of Virginia. And when I first called and offered to help, they said, no thanks, Aaron, we don't need no more lawyers down here. And it took about a year before I finally convinced them that maybe I was a little different, and I got an invitation to come down to the corner of southwest Virginia where mountaintop removal mining is taking place. And I listened to people tell their stories like Vicki and Carol and Donna, and I heard some whoppers. I heard from two of the leaders of SAMS, Southern Appalachian Mountain Stewards of SAMS, is the group of people that banded together. I want to first explain why they banded together. About 10 years ago, almost to the day, coming up on the anniversary, there was a coal company operating illegally outside their permit boundary, and they dislodged a boulder that came careening down the cliff and landed on somebody's house and killed the 3-year-old inside. And people from the community came together and formed this organization, Southern Appalachian Mountain Stewards, to fight. And I learned from one of the leaders about her mother, who liked to sit on her porch every day and read the Bible and look up at the mountain and listen to the birds. And the mountain's blown up and there's coal dust everywhere and you can't breathe, and she can't do that anymore. And I learned about how the coal company didn't actually find enough coal to make it profitable, and so they declared bankruptcy and left. I learned about from one of the other founders of Southern Appalachian Mountain Stewards about how he had tried to challenge a permit for a mountaintop removal mine behind his house, and found somebody who had a young attorney who just gotten out of law school and taken the bar and agreed to represent him for free, and they brought a challenge to the permit before an administrative law judge, and they went through a full-on trial. And during the trial, the administrative law judge asked Mr. Pete Ramey, who's a real stalwart of the community, president of the Kiwanis Club, and very well-respected, deeply religious man, asked him, Mr. Ramey, now, how much you pay for that house of yours? And he said, well, I bought it for a few $100s, back in 1930 or something. And he said, well, I think you got your money's worth. And Pete Ramey told me that at the end of the trial, the judge said, not only, Mr. Ramey, do I find that your case does not have any merit, I'm going to rule in favor of the coal company and allow them to mine, but I also find that you have brought this challenge in bad faith and for the sole purpose of harassing the coal company, and I'm going to order you to pay their attorney fees. So as you might imagine, when I traveled around the hollows around there, I talked to a lot of people who said, look, there's just no point. I mean, just about everybody I talked to was against this kind of mining. Most of them were former miners, deep miners, or their spouses. And they said, look, we understand where we came from, but the way they mine coal today is not the way we mine coal. We didn't kill people and destroy people's communities. And what's going on now is totally different, and it's employing a lot fewer people. But a lot of people are afraid to speak up because they think that there's just no hope. There's no way that you can take on these powerful forces. The coal industry's got so much money, and they own all the politicians, and they own the agencies, and they control the administrative law judges and the whole process. What's the point? Well, in an environment like that, imagine how much courage it takes for these people to get together and try to fight this stuff. And we also have very courageous people with us today, and that's our community organizers who work with these communities and try to help them to come together. And that's Bonnie Swinford, who organizes in Tennessee, and Vicki and Carol's community, and Marley here, who works in Southwest Virginia with SAMS, and Alex, who works in East Kentucky. Do you all want to share any stories from the states where you work?
Well, maybe with the segue from talking about Pete and all them at SAMS, I can kick it off. Well, so I guess I wanted to just talk about Ice and Rock Ridge and about a victory that we've had in Southwest Virginia that is really, I think, a model for what it can look like for groups like Sierra Club Environmental Law Program and Sierra Club organizers to work with local communities that are bringing their own resources to the table, as well as allies from all across the country to stop individual mountaintop removal sites. So Ice and Rock Ridge is one ridge over from the mine that killed Jeremy Davidson in 2004 when they dropped the boulder on his house. SAMS was first getting going about that time, about 2004, 2005. Folks had already been, going out to public hearings to contest new permits and trying to figure this stuff out on their own. And there were still, remnants of folks who'd been fighting strip mining back in the 70s and 80s in Southwest Virginia, but it seemed like a lot of folks just didn't know, it was kind of new territory. About that time, a Sierra Club organizer came in to Southwest Virginia and started linking up with these folks that were forming SAMS and connecting the resources of the Environmental Law Program with the community group and adding that tool of legal challenges to the suite of other tools and tactics that the local organization was using. So in addition to to going out to public hearings with the state regulatory agency, the DMME, about the SMACRA permit. So in addition to that, and in addition to putting road signs out and people's yard signs out in across the community, and in addition to door knocking and holding community meetings and letting folks know just about what kind of impacts could be expected from this permit, we were able to bring the legal eyes of people at the Environmental Law Program to look over the permits and say, here's a problem, and we were able to force the company on to submit over 13 revisions of the SMACRA permit for Ice and Rock Ridge, and that delayed the process and forced them to really button up their permit, and that delayed it by a lot. In addition to doing media and telling the press and keeping this an ongoing story in local press, and in addition to finding landowners who were concerned about the logging that was happening ahead of time of the permit and being able to bring a case to say that this logging that you're doing is actually associated with the mining and sue them on that, and that slowed them down further. And so kind of adding these community tools and building power, combining that with the legal expertise of the law program helped us slow it down and slow it down and slow it down. We were able to raise the Ice and Rock Ridge permit to the attention of the EPA. The EPA issued a specific objection to the water discharge permit, which slowed it down further. And eventually, we've slowed it down so much that the regulatory agency has rejected the permit from the books altogether. And so at this point, we've stopped this mine. And it's been this absolute, this combination of community tactics and legal tactics. And I think, I don't know, in our case in Southwest Virginia, it's been really powerful to be able to combine with lawyers. But at the same time, the shots are called in the community. And the ideas for challenging that logging, and that came from a guy who said, I think that probably shouldn't be happening. And the lawyer said, if you're right, maybe we can do something about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and to follow on that point, I mean, there's been a lot of kind words said about Sierra Club, but let's face it, we've made some big mistakes. And when I say we, I don't just mean Sierra Club, I mean national environmental groups. People who've been working on this issue for a lot of years know that national environmental groups got involved after there was a lot of community opposition and an effort to abolish strip mining throughout these communities. And the national environmental groups, tried to get legislation through Congress. And that's a lot of closed-door meetings in which a lot of the communities that were most affected really didn't have a role. And the upshot was the enactment of the Federal Surface Mining Law, SMACRA, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. And the National Environmental Group saw that as a huge victory. Problem solved, we all went home. And then what? Mountaintop removal mining started. And so, even though the federal surface mining law did address a lot of the problems, and we now have reclamation that we didn't have before, I think the people who live in these communities will tell you that reclamation is pretty ineffective, and that the federal surface mining law seems to have legalized the practice of mountaintop removal mining, and the upshot in a lot of ways the situation is a whole lot worse. And so when I, got involved, and other attorneys who are involved now, we try to learn from that mistake, and to work as closely as we can with the communities, and to let them really be the leaders of the campaign, because they are. These are the people who really are at the forefront, and without whom there is no campaign. And so we work very closely with these communities, and we work with nonprofits, and we're very fortunate to have many attorneys that we can reach out to help us. And one of those attorneys is an attorney based right here in Tennessee by the name of Gina Lewis, and she's going to speak now.
Sharon. I guess I've kind of worn both hats. I started out as an environmental activist, and I'm not sure if I should admit this as a lawyer or not, but I was a fan of direct action and protest and that kind of thing. And I certainly believe that that issues like this belong to the people, belong to the communities, and they belong to us as a collective organization of citizenry, and everybody has a stake in it. I've been very fortunate that I had the opportunity to represent the Sierra Club. I also had the opportunity to work with some very fine lawyers out of West Virginia, Appalachian Mountain Advocates, Joe Lovett and Derek Teeney and Mike Becker and Ben Luckett. And so I think that collectively, through the law, which is what I'm going to talk about, that in the past, I guess we started bringing litigation in Tennessee that I was involved in back in 2008. The first thing that we did, we caught a coal company, Apollo Fuels, mining through some streams in a permit site called the Jellicoe Strip Mine. I think that was the first notice of intent to sue that we sent out. We settled that case. The next case that we did was that we caught National Coal Company discharging selenium without a permit on Zeb Mountain. We settled that case in 2010. They had to pay penalties. It also led to the state putting selenium limits into their NPDES permit. The company challenged those limits. We appealed the limits. In 2011, we again sued National Coal, this time over 3 sites, for discharge violations, basically violating their permit at Zeb Mountain for conventional pollutants, including TSS, iron, manganese, and pH, for discharge for violating their NPDES permit at an underground mine called Mine 14, also for conventional pollutants, and for discharging, and for 2 sets of claims on their Jordan Ridge refuse disposal area, one being permit violations for conventional pollutants, as well as discharging selenium without a permit. We recently settled that case. The company agreed to shut down the Zeb Mountain mine to complete reclamation at that site, also to shut down Mine 14. The company also agreed to apply for and agreed to selenium limits at Zeb Mountain. They agreed to pay stipulated penalties as well as civil penalties. Yeah, that suit, all of those lawsuits could not have happened without dedicated members of the community who generously donated their time. As it turned out in these last suits, quite a bit of time to the case of standing the clearance. We're very grateful to them. One of them is in the audience, Axel, who was a wonderful standing witness, and to him we're extraordinarily grateful and owe a big debt. We have other cases that we're looking into. We recently sent a notice of intent to sue to Crossville Coal, which is a subsidiary of Hillsborough Resources, which is a subsidiary of the Vitol Group. Some of you may have seen that in the newspaper because of the connection between Vitol and Hillsborough Resources with the governor. And some lobbying that was done on their behalf through a lobbyist who failed to register. Basically, that site is the Turner Surface Mine. It's in the Catoosa Wildlife Management Area, which is in Crossville, Tennessee. It's a beautiful area that Aaron has a connection to and perhaps could tell you all a little bit about. That mine is both a surface mine and an underground mine. There are 2 SMACRA permits and 1 NPDES permit. That site is mining the Sewanee coal seam. Back, I think, either in the early 80s, don't remember the exact date, but OSM declared the Sewanee seam to be unsuitable for mining. 1987, thank you, Ann. Because of the extreme toxicity of the seam and because they found that it was not a toxic materials handling plant that could work. Unfortunately, they did not declare the entire seam to be unsuitable. So there are areas of the Sewanee seam outside of the petition area, such as this site. I think, it's my personal opinion, but I think that the case really demonstrates this, that the Sewanee seam is just too acid toxic to mine. We've noticed several claims in that notice of intent to sue. First off, just discharge violations of conventional pollutants, particularly those associated with acid mine drainage. Also high conductivity, sulfates, and TDS. As well as just, one of the streams that receives discharges, the way that OSM defines acid mine drainage is pretty technical, but that stream just consistently shows acid mine drainage as is defined under the SMACRA regulations. So I think that this case is important because not only because this company has consistently violated federal law, the Clean Water Act and Surface Mining Act, but also because Crossville Coal wants to expand its operations into the Catoosa. I think that this lawsuit clarifies why that's an extraordinarily bad idea. I think it also demonstrates that the Sewanee seam is pretty much unmineable. So I think I just have a quick summary of the litigation that I've been involved in Tennessee. I think personally that litigation is one tool in the toolbox. I think it's an important tool. I think that you can basically have an extraordinarily big impact with the right lawsuit. But I also think that it's important to recognize the fact that it's not a panacea, that it's not, that it's one tool that you want to use and not the only tool. I think it's very important to recognize, just looking at lawsuits themselves, that no lawsuit is possible without standing the clearance. That you have the best legal claims in the world, but if you don't have citizens who are willing to participate in the case, you don't have a case, you know, you get thrown out of court. And I think that being standing declarance, that it gives people, you know, well, that standing declarance really own the case. And their communities really own the case, because without them, the case isn't possible. So, you know, I think that thinking of a lawsuit just being like a bunch of lawyers, like writing some briefs and filing some stuff, you know, that's really not what it's about. You know, it's a collective effort between legal representatives and the people in the community to stand up and to take action, you know, and the people in the community to tell their stories to the court as to why this activity affects them, how it affects them, how it affects their communities, and to have ownership of the case. I mean, you know, we had several standing declarants, one of whom is Axel. Well, you know, shutting down the Zed Mountain mine, you know, they did that. You know, we participated in it, but that victory really belongs to them and to those communities. And you know, and if the Crossville case is successful, then it'll belong to those people who stood up and took action, and you know, hopefully, you know, we'll have a good impact. So, as I said, I've kind of worn all hats. I think all hats are equally important. So, do you have anything?
Thanks, Gina. All right, I think it's time for a little law. See what some of these words mean. SMACRA, Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. That's the federal surface mining law. So this is administered by the Office of Surface Mining, or OSM, and that is a law that was passed, I think it was enacted in '77, and it requires reclamation of surface coal mines. And in Tennessee, permits, in order to do, so I'm going to describe what permits are needed to conduct mountaintop removal mining. So one type of permit you need is a surface mining permit under SMACRA. And Tennessee is the only state in the region where the surface mining permits are still issued by the Office of Surface Mining, the federal agency, which gives us some legal hooks in Tennessee that we don't have in the other states. In the other states, OSM, the Surface Mining Agency, has delegated the permitting authority to the states. So in West Virginia and Kentucky, the states issue the surface mine permit. That, Gina talked about the comprehensive strategy that we employ, and I can't emphasize that enough. It's lawsuits in isolation, in my experience, are not usually effective. You might win in court, but your victories are often going to get undone on appeal, or by a hostile legislature, or by a government agency that changes the regulations that you sue under. You've got to have the community demand. That's why it's so important to be working with communities. That's why it's so important to have the local grassroots groups that you're working with. And we put pressure on the agencies to tighten the regulations, and we'll talk about some of the successes that we've had. The surface mining law also creates opportunities to demand public hearings, where citizens can turn out and show that there is community opposition. It presents opportunities to get on site. If you are aware of a violation of law that's occurring, you can demand a site inspection. And through those site inspections that local residents have gone on, sometimes accompanied by attorneys like Gina, we might collect a water sample. And that might turn out to be the basis of our lawsuit. We have one really good story along those lines. So that's one type of permit they need. They also need two types of permits under the Clean Water Act, another federal law enacted in the early 70s. The Clean Water Act requires two types of permits for mountaintop removal mines. It requires what are called NPDES permits, NPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits. So the Clean Water Act, when it was enacted, the idea is we're going to eliminate all pollution in the waters. Well, that certainly hasn't happened. But it does have a very, very powerful provision. It says no one, no company, nobody can put any pollutants into the water waters of the United States, flowing rivers and streams, unless it's authorized by a permit, and that's this IPTES permit. And those permits are also issued by the states. Also in Tennessee, that's the case. So in each of the 4 states where we work on mountaintop removal, those permits are issued by the states. Then they need, the mining companies need another type of Clean Water Act permit. We lawyers call it a 404 permit because it's Section 404 of the Clean Water Act that requires this. This is Section 402. And the 404 permits are also called valley fill permits. So these are the permits that allow mining companies, when they blow up the mountain, all that rubble, waste, they push it into the valley below, bury the streams below. 2,000 miles of Appalachian mountain streams have been buried by mining waste. And that's authorized by these valley fill Section 404 permits. They're issued by a federal agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So that's basically what we're dealing with. And I think I'm going to go from there to the PowerPoint. Somebody made it. Okay, so I'm going to run through some slides initially, just to talk about and hopefully visually demonstrate a little bit the impacts of mountaintop removal. And we'll go through those quickly, and then I'm going to focus the bulk of my presentation on the legal strategies that the Sierra Club is employing with local communities and with local groups to try to stop it. So first of all, what is mountaintop removal mining? That gives you a sense of what it looks like. Next slide. So basically they blow up the mountain, 800 to 1,000 feet, and push it all into the streams below. This is a picture of Capeford Mountain in West Virginia. And you can see this site from property of the late Larry Gibson, who's one of the true heroes of the movement, whom we've lost tragically. But Larry's had people from all over the world come and see firsthand from his property how bad the destruction is. Just countless reporters and so forth have been up there. And you know, I mentioned that people do this at great personal risk, and you know, when I went and visited Larry for the first time, I got to experience that a little bit. I mean, he showed me where his home was shot full of bullet holes, and told me about how his dog had been killed, and we were walking out to what he calls Hell's Gate, which is at the edge of his property where you can see the scene of destruction. He said, "Aaron, take a look at that." And there was a spring-loaded treble hook in the tree ready to zap you in the face when you walk through there. He said he finds them all. He said he found them all the time. So you've got these beautiful forested mountains that are completely devegetated, blown up, these gigantic drag lines, and then all the waste gets poured into the valleys below. Next slide. This is the area where mountaintop removal occurs. West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, but also, as we talked about, this corner of Southwest Virginia and in Tennessee. I grew up in Tennessee, and I used to love to go to the mountains and go hiking and paddling, and I didn't even know we had coal mining here. So it's, but when you go into those areas, it's pretty awful what you see, and it's not all that different from what you see in places like West Virginia. Next. So they say that there is no mountaintop removal mining in Tennessee. I guess there aren't valley fills in the same sense that there are in the other states. But Zeb Mountain, for instance, we were told is not a mountaintop removal mine. It's a cross ridge mine or something or other. But they blow up the mountain and they push all the rubble into the streets below. And you know, they're blowing up the mountain. That's mountaintop removal mining to me. And I am proud to say, as Gina has already mentioned, that through litigation, in part, we were able to close the Zeb Mountain. We tried to stop it from going forward. The very first case I worked on mountaintop removal, I worked on with Mary Maston back there in the corner, and we were trying to stop the permitting for mountaintop removal. It was one of those tragic situations where we actually won the case. The court determined that the Office of Surface Mining had not adequately looked at alternatives under the National Environmental Policy Act, and therefore it violated NEPA. Now normally when you get a court that determines that there's been a violation of environmental law, they issue an injunction. But the court rather mysteriously said that it was harmless error and they could go ahead with the mine anyway. So they broke the law, but there ain't no consequence, evidently. Next slide. So what kind of environmental destruction are we talking about? Well, as we mentioned, it destroys forests more than, this stat I think is old, 1.4 million acres. I think it's probably considerably more than that now. About the size of Delaware. And not to mention, of course, the streams and so forth. Next slide. 244 species affected by that, as well as aquatic life, of course. So you've got disappearing wildlife. And so that's led us to look for legal hooks relating to those impacts. Next slide. So there was, during the Clinton administration, before I was involved, allies of ours were successful in enforcing an environmental impact statement. Office of Surface Mining did an environmental impact statement on all mountaintop removal mining. So we learned for the first time what some of the impacts are. That environmental impact statement is now about 8 years old, and as of then, there were 1,200 miles of Appalachian streams that had been buried in mining waste, and now it's over 2,000 miles. Next slide. Okay, so now we get into some of our legal strategies. So what's an ESA concern? ESA is the Environmental Endangered Species Act, one of our nation's most powerful laws. I have little doubt that mountaintop removal mining is wiping out a lot of species, and that there are a lot of threatened and endangered species in the Appalachian Mountains. But you know what? New species only get added to the Endangered Species Act when citizens bring lawsuits and force the government to put them on the list. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the species that are imperiled in Appalachia have not yet received the protection of this law. But there is a lot of work being done, especially by Center for Biological Diversity, to get new species listed, and that's giving us some new hooks. And here in Tennessee, we have brought our first ever Endangered Species Act case to try to stop new mine, Davis Creek number 4 mine, I believe it is. And we also included Zeb Mountain. And the impacts, regarding the impacts to the federally listed black-side dace, which is a threatened species, and the Cumberland darter, which is federally listed as endangered. So, you know, what the agencies tend to say about species is they point to that old environmental impact statement and they say, well, you know, these laws that regulate mining are so powerful and they're so well enforced by the states that we don't have to consider the effects to species because, you know, they're all doing just fine. Well, we all know that that's not true, and in fact, one of the pollutants that EPA has sort of brought to light in recent years, one of the problems is what's known as conductivity pollution, which measures electrical current and is an indication of the heavy metals that are in the water. I'm not a scientist, so that's a very rough explanation. But some of the most recent scientific evidence that's come out of, I think out of the University here in Tennessee, is that conductivity pollution is harming these endangered fish species. And the EPA, in fact, has said, look, you know, generally conductivity levels we think should be no higher than 300, and if they get higher than 500, then that's a big problem. And the EPA published guidance in the first term of the Obama administration saying that and encouraged the states to start regulating conductivity pollution. So how many states do you think are now regulating conductivity pollution? 0. Okay, so we're going to try to force them to. But we know from these recent studies that this endangered fish species actually suffers pretty severe harm when conductivity levels get above 200. So even at lower levels than the EPA has said is a problem. And yet, when the permits were issued, there was no consideration of those impacts whatsoever. And so we are suing the Office of Surface Mining and the Fish and Wildlife Service for failing to consult and to disclose the effects of the proposed Davis Creek mine and the operating, at that time, Zeb mine on these two fish species, because we know that the conductivity levels will far exceed 200, and there's nothing in these permits that would prevent that. There's probably people in this room who've gone out and tested Appalachian mountain streams for conductivity, which I see some nodding from Anna, Donna, Carol, and others. Typically what you find, streams below mine sites, you have conductivity levels right around the safe level. Is that generally what you see, Ann?
Oh, absolutely. According to TDEC, they're saying. But according to TDEC, 1500, so, because we have tough before and comment, so.
Yeah, we regularly see conductivity levels well over 1,000. In fact, I've never heard of a stream below a coal mine site that had a conductivity level below 500. So if the law were being enforced, there would be no mountaintop removal line. That's the truth, under the Clean Water Act and under other laws. So that's a case that we have just recently filed. So we'll see how it goes. And they relied on an old biological opinion that was done in 1996 that basically said the state is doing such a good job enforcing the law, we don't need to worry about species. So we're going to try and show that that biological opinion is way out of date, and that there's more recent scientific evidence that shows that in fact this is a huge problem. Well, I also wanted to describe a little bit our strategy generally. Before President Obama took office, our main strategy was stopping new mines. There were just dozens and dozens of new mines that were coming in all the time. The one thing that stopped those mines were lawsuits that were brought mostly by Joe Lovett, Appalachian Mountain Advocates, and then we started working with Joe. And our goal was to challenge every single new mountaintop removal mine. And we got them we got all the mines pretty much tied up in court injunctions. Typically what's happened to Joe over his career is he brings a case, he wins every single case in district court, stops the mine, and then the case goes up on appeal. And the first few times it was always before the same 3 judges. And they would all get reversed on appeal. The first case was the famous Bragg case, where there's a federal regulation that requires a 100-foot buffer around streams, the so-called stream buffer zone rule. And so Joe Lovett brought a case, said, when you bury the stream, you're not complying with the buffer zone rule. And he got a district court judge in West Virginia to say, yes, that's in fact what the law says, and declared mountaintop removal mining to be illegal, which created quite a political mess. People got pretty upset, and there was quite a bit of backlash. That case then went up on appeal, and the government, the Clinton administration, actually agreed with us on the merits. But the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed. Not on the merits, but on an obscure principle of constitutional law, basically found that we were suing the state for issuing a permit in violation of federal law, and that's not consistent with principles of sovereign immunity and the 11th Amendment. Case dismissed. Then came up with a new theory under the Clean Water Act, got all the mines tied up again under an injunction, challenging the 404 permits. There's been a series of 3 of these. The one that I was most recent, when I started getting involved, our main theory was related to the mitigation that the companies do. basically the way the agency justifies burying streams and mining waste is they say, well, there's no adverse environmental impact whatsoever from burying those streams. Now, how do they get there? What they say is, and so they don't even do an environmental impact statement typically. They issue what's called a finding of no significant impact. And what they say is, well, they're going to bury, 20 miles of streams, but they're going to create 30 miles of streams. So it's actually good for the environment. Now, if any of you have ever seen these streams, these so-called streams that they create to mitigate the effects of burying, they're not streams at all. They're literally barren rock ditches. They have no life in them. They're utterly lifeless. And so our argument was they might have the structure of a stream. They look like a stream, the way a concrete culvert would, but they don't have the function of a stream. And under the Corps guidelines and regulations, you have to mitigate not just the loss of stream structure, but also the loss of stream function. Once again, on appeal, we lost. The court ruled, in essence, that the Army Corps of Engineers, they're the experts. They say it's just fine. The state says it's just fine. So we have to assume it's just fine. Case dismissed. The good news, so we lost that particular big case, and this was the third roundup on appeal, where it's just shut it all down, then reversed on appeal. Use a new theory, shut them all down, reversed on appeal. Use a new theory, shut them all down, reversed on appeal, but then President Obama was elected, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency did two things that were very helpful. They announced that they were going to subject, so we were quite worried that when that last case was reversed, there was about, I forget how many, maybe 90 permits or something that had been held up. And, you know the number, Ann?
121.
121. It's even always worse than I think it is. The Obama EPA came in and said, we're not going to let the Army Corps issue those permits right away. We were terrified. How are we going to challenge 121 mines all at once? Instead, we're going to, they announced what they called their enhanced coordinated review process, where they would scrutinize each of the permits, negotiate with the Corps, the company, try to make them better. And that slowed everything down, which was very helpful. They also issued the conductivity guidance that I mentioned earlier. They said that, the science shows that conductivity levels, which below these mine sites tend to be very high, and the science shows that when those levels reach 500 or higher, that violates water quality standards. And they encouraged the states to adopt limits. But as I mentioned, not a single state has done so. But the upshot of those small baby steps that the Obama administration took is that there have been very few new permits for new mountaintop removal mines have been issued since Obama took office. But make no mistake, they are definitely still approving some. So we continue to challenge everywhere we can the permits for the new mountaintop removal mines when they're issued. Now, when I say everywhere we can, what do I mean by that? I want to explain what Gina mentioned, and maybe you went to her workshop earlier, you probably learned all about this, but the concept of standing, a standing declarant. So we can't just go into court and say, hey, we're the Sierra Club, we're an environmental group, so we want to sue. The law actually says we can. It says any citizen may bring a lawsuit to challenge a violation of these environmental laws. That's what Congress said. But the courts have said, oh no, but the Constitution doesn't allow that. The Constitution only allows courts to hear actual cases and controversies. And in order for there to be an actual case or controversy, you need to be personally affected, personally harmed by the violation of law that you're suing over, and the relief that you're trying to get from the court, what you're asking the court to do, has to redress that harm. Otherwise, you have no right to be in court. Now that, in some sense, is probably a good thing. You don't want people who have no interest in what's going on bringing lawsuits willy-nilly. The problem is that very conservative judges have made it so difficult to meet these standards. They've interpreted these standards in a way as to make it so difficult that it is almost impossible to get into court. So we need to be able to demonstrate that we have a member or members of our organizations that are bringing the lawsuits who are, are unquestionably personally harmed by what we're suing over. So, these mine sites are on private property, and the nearest resident is going to be at least a few miles away, and often more. And so, it's very difficult even to find someone who's that close, close enough to where the courts will say that's good enough. And then, when you do, you're asking that person basically to risk his or her life, to get involved in this. I mean, once you become a standing declarant and you live in one of these communities and all your friends and neighbors work for the coal industry, and it comes out that you're the person, who enabled the Sierra Club to bring this lawsuit to stop this mine, imagine how you're going to be treated. Now, I'll just share one of countless stories through the hollers about this. The story of Maria Gunno, and when she became a standing declarant in one of these cases, there was others in her community who really wanted the case to be brought, but they just didn't want to put themselves at such personal risk. But Maria decided she was going to do it, and others probably know her story much better than I do. But as I understand it, people put up, the coal companies put up basically wanted posters, like in westerns, wanted posters with Marie's face on them, all over the community. And then people started coming to her house and just harassing her and her son, and she had to literally surround her house in razor barbed wire and get a trained guard dog in order to be safe. So, when I say that people like, Carol Judy, Vicki Terry, and Donna and Axel are heroes, I mean, I really mean it. I mean, imagine the job that our organizers have to do. Marley and Bonnie and Alex has to ask people, are you willing to put yourself at such great risk so that we can bring this lawsuit, knowing that we may not win. It's a tough thing to do. All right, so beyond the environmental destruction, of course, we've got all the community impacts we've been talking about. Next slide. Flooding, devastating flooding.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Real quick? The lady from West Virginia was talking about providing standing in some cases, and yet your husband works for the coal company?
He did work.
Okay, so I was wondering how that played out. If you had, what happened?
I have brothers and cousins that still work for the coal company.
Yeah, so actually a time check, I think we're gonna go into a question and answer session
Okay.
in just a few
I was just really
minutes
curious
here.
about that when she said it earlier.
Sure,
So.
yeah.
But, I get accused of causing people to lose their jobs and things like that. But you have to do something because
Yeah.
people are hurting so bad and the coal companies are so big.
So flooding, I mean, Maria Gunno's house was flooded out as a result of mountaintop removal above her house, and countless others have been as well. Next slide. We talked about sludge impoundments that are all over the mountains, this toxic sludge. Next slide. Contaminated water. We talked about people's drinking water supplies being poisoned. Next slide. Coal dust. This is a picture of the community of Rhoda in Southwest Virginia, where Marley works. And when I first came there on my very first trip and started meeting with local residents, what you tend to hear about the most is the blasting of the dust. And so this is Rhoda Road, and at the time I think there were 4, 5, 6 surface mines that were operating up that road, and they all hauled their coal right through this community.
It's also underground mines.
Underground mines too. And you can see how close these houses are to these trucks that haul this coal. And so this is a mailbox of a person who worked with us on this and wanted to fight them, Mr. Willis. And we worked with another woman up the street, Nell Campbell, who's 90 years old, I believe. And when I first went there, these coal trucks were whizzing by just like a few, it was like 10 a minute. It was just unbelievable. And the house was just caked in coal dust. And this guy, Mr. Willis, he would vacuum up his house. He kept it really clean, but he just had to constantly clean the coal dust and just couldn't breathe, along with everybody else in that community. So we found a scientist at North Carolina State University to work with us, and we measured the coal dust that we were being exposed to. Next slide. This is the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, 150. And so above micrograms per cubic meter, and above this level is considered unsafe by the Environmental Protection Agency. And these are the readings that we got in this Campbell's house. I mentioned a 90-year-old lady. So you can see we got readings 3 times the safe levels. We brought all that information to the attention, and a lot of the community residents came up to the Virginia Air Pollution Control Board, presented this, and asked them to issue an enforcement order, and also to tighten their regulations, to require just basic things. I mean, street sweepers, truck wash, rumble strips, to keep the dust levels down. Our presentation was powerful, of course, as was the testimony of the local residents. And the coal companies didn't come the first time, but the second time they came, and they realized that the air board was, at least there were some air board members that were very, very deeply disturbed by what we were presenting. And so as a result of those presentations, they put in all the things that we were asking for. And then the state went and did their own measurements and said, oh, there's no problem here at all. And we said, well, that's because they put all these things in, so please issue an enforcement order and make them stay in place, because otherwise they're going to take them out. We lost on a tie vote because our champion was sailing in the Caribbean, and otherwise we would have won. So it was a heartbreaker, but we did get some relief for the community. Next slide. Human health impacts. Okay, so Dr. Michael Hendricks and with West Virginia University and others have shown that there's a tremendous correlation between severe health problems like cancer and heart disease and birth defects and living in a community that's impacted by surface coal mining. It's even factoring in lifestyle things, smoking and diet and so forth, that there's much, much higher levels of disease in these communities. And so I mentioned that there are still mountaintop removal mine permits being issued on occasion, and we're still challenging them whenever we have standing and whenever we can. And we have 2 challenges going right now, one in Kentucky against the LECO mine, and one in West Virginia against the Ravencrest mine. And the argument, one of the arguments that we're making is that the Army Corps, the federal agency that issues the valley fill permits, should consider the adverse health effects of these mines before issuing these permits, as they're required to do under the National Environmental Policy Act. They should do an environmental impact statement and address these health concerns. So those cases are still pending. We will see how they come out. Next. So this is a slide that just talks about how, mountaintop removal mining employs a lot fewer people than traditional deep mining, and a lot of the loss of jobs is a result of this method of mining, not because of environmental loss. Next. Solutions, renewable energy, efficiency, just economic transition. These are the things that we need for Appalachia and for the country. Next. Okay, so now I have a whole number of slides about yet another legal tool that we use. And I think that rather than go through all of these, go through all the details, because I know that we're running out of time, I'm gonna summarize all of this in just a few minutes. So we've heard about this pollutant selenium. And this is a naturally occurring mineral that's found in many coal seams across Appalachia. And when they blow up the mountain and they bury the stream with all that rubble, all this selenium leaches out. Now the selenium is not, at the levels that we see below mines, is actually not harmful to human health the way a lot of the other pollutants are, but it's extremely harmful to fish, to aquatic life. And so I mentioned that before Obama took office and the EPA greatly reduced the number of permits that were being issued, our main focus was stopping new mines from coming in. We've now shifted our focus to go after active mines and corporate landholding companies that have leased their land to coal companies, and where the mine sites have been reclaimed, supposedly, but are still spewing selenium pollution. And we're trying to hold these mines and corporate landholding companies accountable for their selenium pollution. We want them to treat the selenium so it's not wreaking havoc with the aquatic ecosystem. And so these are Clean Water Act enforcement cases. In West Virginia, there are actually limits on selenium as a result of prior legal actions that Joe Lovett in particular has brought. And in the other states, the states refuse to put in limits. And so we're suing the coal companies using a much more aggressive cutting-edge theory that these are unpermitted discharges of pollution. And we won one of those cases recently in Southwest Virginia. We're particularly focusing on selenium because it is so expensive to treat. When we first got started, it cost tens of millions of dollars to treat each pipe at a mine site, and there might be a couple dozen pipes at a single mine. And so we've achieved settlements that have forced companies to install technology that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. As a result of that, we've been able to force some companies not only to install treatment, but to agree to stop doing any mountaintop removal mining. And that includes Patriot Coal Company in West Virginia. It includes National Coal here in Tennessee. And we plan to do a whole lot more of these types of clean water enforcement cases. Gina's working on some of them. And that's our primary strategy now. We're trying to force the industry to internalize the true cost of their mining. Can you skip to my last slide? Is there a victory slide? Yeah. So, since 2008, Central Appalachian coal production is down nearly 43%. So, you know, that's a product of a number of things. It's certainly the dropping cost of natural gas has been part of it. But I think without question, the work that we're doing with the folks in this room, the community members, has really contributed to that. We've got Patriot and National Coal to agree to stop, and most recently, Southern Coal agreed it is going to dramatically reduce its burning of mountaintop removal mine coal, Central Appalachian coal, from about 1/3 in 2007. Now it will be down to about 1%. Just a few examples of some of the huge successes that we've achieved through these strategies. So I think I will stop there, and we will open it up for questions. Otherwise, I'm going to lecture you about the law. So.
Ask questions, please.
That lady out yonder had a question and she agreed. Oh, did you get your question answered?
Yeah, but I did have another question.
Sure, go ahead.
I don't know a lot about the laws related to the mountaintop removal, but I was really interested about the issue about the 100-foot barrier.
Stream buffer zone.
And then the ruling that rebuilding the stream would be okay. I mean, that just baffles my mind. Surely there were experts about aquatic communities that just in no way resembled an actual stream, but was
Yes.
like a gully.
We have some of the nation's leading experts and top academics in the country who are helping us and who published a number of studies, including the one that was in Nature, and it's been extensively covered. The EPA has heavily relied on it in the steps that it's taken. There's overwhelming scientific evidence showing that the stream function is not replaced through these rock drainage ditches.
Yeah.
And it is, I don't know what to say, except that it's a lot depends on what judges you draw, and it makes a big difference who's in office and who's appointing the judges. And I think the Fourth Circuit ruling in that case is simply appalling. I don't think it can be justified or defended.
Wouldn't it be useful to pursue getting a legal definition of a stream to include aquatic life and that kind of thing?
You know what we've tried to do in the first term of the Obama administration, what we said is when they blow up the mountain, all that stuff that they put in the stream, it's waste, right? So it should be classified as waste. Instead, it's classified as fill. So if you want to build a house and you need to fill in part of a wetland, that's fill. It's, you fill it for the purpose of building a house. What they're doing in Appalachia is simply dumping waste into streams. And so we lobbied the EPA to change the definition of mining waste to waste instead of fill. And they didn't have the political guts to do it.
Can I say a little bit about that? Since that was actually made possible in 2002 by an administrative move that changed the definition of the word fill in SMACRA so that it could contain mining waste. And there has been a grassroots effort to change it legislatively with what's called the Clean Water Protection Act, which would take that definition back to its original intent, where mining waste could not be used as fill. So there have been several different efforts on different fronts to try to do that. The Clean Water Protection Act is still trying to go through legislatively. It's been, I think will be its 8th year when it gets reintroduced coming up. But it's, everybody's fighting on different fronts.
I'll say a word too about the buffer zone rule because we also have litigation involving that. So when George W. Bush came into office, he wanted to make sure that nobody could ever bring the same lawsuit again, say in state court, saying that filling upstream is violating this 100-foot buffer requirement. And so the Bush administration changed the rule to make it perfectly clear that the buffer zone rule did not mean that you could not dump mining waste into streams. And they did no environmental analysis whatsoever. They said it would actually improve the environment. And so we sued, and we said, no, this is going to be extremely environmental destructive, and so you have to disclose the environmental effects in an environmental impact statement. And it also violates the Clean Water Act. And that case is still pending.
And in my community of place, in relationship to lobbying, Vicki Terry's granddaughter from age, what was she, 10, 11 when she first went to D.C., lobbied for 5 straight years about the Clean Water Act, and last year told her grandma she wasn't going back because they just didn't want to listen. They were told and told and told. And still, you know what's good about that? Is there is a 16-year-old young woman in my community who understands the process of legislative action, but has informed herself. So she will implement in her community of place the standards she wants, whether the federal government does or not. And that's where your rooted change happens, when you can merge the two interests. Different timeline. But I got a 16-year-old young woman in my community who's going to be done. Y'all hang around and watch her.
It's already dynamite.
Yes,
I'd like to add something about the health study. That is true because in my community alone, we have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. One of them's got brain cancer, and the other one's got pancreatic cancer, and that's something you never used to see at all. We have an increase in respiratory problems, increase in seizures, just all kind of health studies, not only, in the elderly, particularly in our young people, and the increase in birth defects also. And that was one reason why that I got so involved in it. I was also a county school nurse, and it was just, hit you in the face, all the problems that the children were having and still are having. And it is directly related. And last weekend, also, I heard a speech by a professor at WVU, Michael McCauley. And according to him, there are ultrafine particles in the air that the air quality instruments cannot read right now. So whatever they're reading, it does show that it's not harm to your health, some of the studies. But these ultraviolet, these ultra small particles are, and they're the kind that gets deep into your lungs, and you don't cough them out and expel them. So therefore, you do have an increase in respiratory lung cancer and things like that.
When we did in Rhoda, the measurements of the dust, one of the arguments that the coal companies, I'm in the state, made, the DEQ, on behalf of the coal companies, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. They said, those readings you got, they're false. It's wrong. We've looked at it, and what you measured is not PM10, particles smaller than 10 microns. They're actually much larger particles. And they showed this slide of this particle that was, looked great big. And they have another picture of a thing that was real small. See, this is PM10. This is what these guys recorded. And so I was like, uh-oh, we're in trouble. I called up our scientists and I said, what, I told him the story, and I said, what are they talking about? And this is a man who is an Indian-American gentleman, and he said, Aaron, you need not worry yourself. They are full of horse. You know what? And he said, what they are seeing is the tiny particles aggregate together and look like a big particle, but they are actually much smaller particles. And I said, well, how do we prove that, Dr. Aneja? He said, very simple. We do electron microscopy. We will magnify this image 1,000 times more powerful than what they have, and we will show that they are lying. And so that's exactly what we did at the very next presentation. That's when we started seeing the truck sweepers and Yes.
I'm sorry I came in late, so I don't know whether you discussed this, but can you make some comments about, for instance, the Triple H mine in Anderson County, Tennessee, that was purchased by a Chinese company and is getting ready to start?
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I know little about it. What about you, Gina? I saw the TV
What do
ad.
you know about this?
About, in general, this trend that Chinese companies are going to buy American coal companies.
It's going to help us in the Tennessee legislature. The Tea Party people don't mind if we blow up the mountains if it's Americans who are doing it. But if it's Chinese who are blowing up our mountains, boy, they do not want that to happen.
Well, to speak to that, like what Gina was talking about, the Turner Mine, that company is actually owned by a Swiss company. So we are seeing some international owners coming.
To me, the more
the latest
disturbing
thing I've heard about the Triple H is that the Chinese haven't paid for anything for it yet.
That's what two of the H's say. The other H says he's not getting his fair share.
To me, the more disturbing thing is what Carol talked about. It's how you go into these areas, and all of the land is owned by out-of-state corporations, big, giant corporate land holding companies. And when I first came to Appalachia with the Sierra Club, that's one thing. So I heard I heard Aaron. I said, well, who are the worst coal companies? Who do you want us to go after? And they told me, and they said, but Aaron, who's really evil is the big land holding company that owns all the land in this area and is hiding in the shadows. And that's a company called Penn, Virginia. And they own all the land in this area, and they've leased all the land to coal companies, and they're profiting from it, and they're hiding in the shadows, and nobody knows anything about it. And so one of our new strategies is to sue the big land holding companies at mine sites that have been reclaimed, but are still spewing toxic pollution, and holding them accountable so that if they have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up the sites that the coal companies left behind, maybe they'll think twice about leasing their land to the coal industry next time.
Aaron, I was going to ask you that earlier. We've been going and investigating oil and gas wells on both public lands here in Tennessee, but also maybe it's snuck onto a little bit of private lands too. That thing, and it's abandoned mining areas where they did strip mining, contour mining, whatever. It's left these nice shells. They present themselves as nice places to establish these well pads, and we're noticing really egregious erosion occurring because of the construction of these roads with inadequate, erosion controls on them or culverts. And I'm thinking, wow, when we go up and do these investigations, we should be doing testing for whatever it is that we can go after these largely, like you're saying, timber REITs or other institutional property owners that are profiting.
Sounds good. Yes.
Another thing that I find really disturbing about the way the industry is functioning right now is not just absentee ownership, but the fact that so much of the coal is being shipped overseas. They're wanting to open coal mines in the county I live in Tennessee, which currently doesn't have any coal mining, and ship it over to China. Talking about inefficient use of energy. But I wanted to ask a question about lands unsuitable for mining petitions. I don't know if y'all have much familiarity with that, but Gina mentioned the Sewanee coal seam, and I know in Bledsoe County they got a lands unsuitable for mining petition to stop mining of that because of how acidic the acid mine drainage would be, is my understanding.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have experience with using that tactic?
Yes, some have had some success with lands unsuitable for mining. This is a type of petition that citizens can file under the federal surface mining law, and you basically file a petition and you argue that for some particular reason this area should not be mined because the coal seam is too toxic, because the resources are too sensitive, or something unique about the site. We filed a lands unsuitable for mining petition to try to stop mountaintop removal mining at Blair Mountain. How many people in this room have heard of Blair Mountain? Oh, good. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, it was the site of a huge armed conflict between coal miners who were trying to unionize and coal company gun thugs. And this armed conflict took place, some say I think the largest armed conflict in the United States since the Civil War. And the miners lost the fight when the National Guard came in. But it's a very historic site, and there's still lots of historic resources. And it's one area where we're actually on the same side as the United Mine Workers. They've joined with us in our lawsuit as a friend of the court, arguing in our favor. But what we did was we filed a massive lands unsuitable for mining petition arguing that this area should not be mountaintop removal mine because it's such an historically important site and there are all these historic archaeological resources on site. The state denied our petition as frivolous. They said, well, 20 years ago somebody sought to do the same thing, and we denied it then because nobody surveyed the land and there wasn't any evidence of any archaeological artifacts. And so you're just asking for the same thing, so we deny it as frivolous. They ignored the fact that since then there have been countless archaeological studies done and the whole site has been fully mapped and everything. So we sued in state court. And that case has been sitting there for 3 years and state court judge refuses to rule. We also have a federal case involving Blair Mountain. We were successful because of organizers and citizens working together. We're able to get Blair Mountain put on the National Register of Historic Places. Basically, if you nominate a site and if it's deemed eligible, which Blair Mountain was, it's put on the National Register and receives additional protections. But the coal companies started putting pressure on property owners, and they trumped up property owners, we think. And if they're able to get a majority to say no, you stop the listing. They were not successful, and so we got the site put on the list. And they said, oh, wait a minute, we found some more names after they'd already put on the list, and the Park Service took it off. And we're suing the Park Service. We say it's illegal. Our case was thrown out because of lack of standing. The district court judge in D.C. said even though our standing clearance, and people who include people who live right there, and archaeologists who study the site and everything else, no standing because it's purely speculative whether they will ever be mining there. Now we said, well, wait a minute. Mining companies have like multiple permits and can start mining there any day. And the judge said he rejected that argument because they haven't started mining yet. And even though they can start mining any day and have all their permits, the fact that they haven't started mining yet suggests that they may not mine it. And so therefore, our injury is too speculative. Now I think that ruling is absurd, and we're up on appeal, and we'll see how that goes.
Who was the judge?
It might be recorded. I don't think I signed the waiver, by the way.
But this is an example. Meanwhile, in the communities of places while all this is going on, our periphery is still living immediately with some of the impacts and results and the dialogues and the uncertainties and the confusions that go on, because what do we have in place of? We're trying. God knows if hard work would have fixed Appalachia, we'd have fixed it a long time ago. I mean, we like our communities. We want to be there. This is a place where the mergings can enable us to be there and enable people who live beyond our boundaries and our borders to, I mean, if we have good health in the mountains, humans are going to have good healthy water and air. Ain't none of us figured out how to live without that. You know, it takes all this, so I'm pleased to death to be working with these national groups that I grew up reading about in National Geographic. I'm serious, you know, I learned a lot at reading National Geographic. So, I don't know, I just think that we need to plan something like, this year, this is how we'll celebrate success and figure it out from the different class and cultures and places. Education to me is critical. We're all being educated here today. We need to do more of it.
Absolutely.
Well, and speaking of educating ourselves, I'm hoping that many of you are in this room want to learn about the work that Sierra Club's doing and our partner organizations, but too because you care about this issue, maybe you want to be more involved personally or on your campuses or back with the groups that you work with. So a few resources that I'm sure I see so many familiar faces that a lot of you know of these, but maybe not everyone in the room does. So I thought it might be worth us just giving you some take-home different resources. So if you've got a pen, maybe get it out, you can write down some different websites. Regionally, there is the Alliance for Appalachia. You can go to theallianceforappalachia.org, and it's a coalition of 14 nonprofits fighting mountaintop removal. You can find out through that network about a lot of the work happening across the whole region. There's also a mostly youth-based network called Mountain Justice. You go to mountainjustice.org. There's lots of stickers out here on the tables. They provide training camps in the summer, and the fall, and the winter, and the spring. It's a great place to take campus groups, youth groups. Then locally, if you'd like to stay up to date with the work happening in Tennessee, you can go to tnmtr.org, and that will link you to a part of the Sierra Club website about mountaintop removal in Tennessee. I also have a blog called MTR in TN at blogspot.com, and that's another place you can go to learn about current permits and upcoming hearings, different things happening. If you're not on the Sierra Club list, you can sign up on that and find out ways to participate when there are citizen actions that are needed. And then there's, Marley, you want to do your thing for?
Well, in Virginia, I think the most up-to-date thing is just samsva.org. That's samsva.org. And that's the local community group SAM's website. And we kind of keep news about we've got a new permit that we're trying to get out in front of in Dickinson County, Virginia. And we're also working heavily on the Coalfield Expressway, which is a public-private partnership strip mine expressway that would destroy and open up a bunch of new surface mining in Virginia. So anyways, yeah, samsva.org for us.
So lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't do some acknowledgments, so I really should do that. I mean, first and foremost, I really want to acknowledge all of the mountain residents with whom we work and the organizations with which they're affiliated, and Vicki, Terry, and Carol, and Donna, and Ann. And, you know, thank you all so much, and let's give them a round of applause. I want to acknowledge Southern Appalachian Mountain Stewards in Southwest Virginia, the group that we work with there. I want to acknowledge the three groups that we work with in West Virginia the most, OVAC, Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition, the West Virginia Highlands Conservancy, and Cold River Mountain Watch. And in Tennessee, statewide communities, statewide organized for community empowerment. Thank you, man. Sorry about that. And also Tennessee Clean Water Network. In Kentucky, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. Our attorney allies, Appalachian Mountain Advocates in West Virginia, and they help us in all the states. Southern Environmental Law Center helps us in Virginia and Tennessee. We've got national groups like Earth Justice, Public Justice, Defenders of Wildlife, National Wildlife Federation who help us out. We've got lots of attorneys like Gina Lewis here, who's a big help, Stephanie at Tennessee Clean Water Network in Tennessee, Kentucky, Mary Cromer with Appalachian Citizens Law Center, Tom Fitzgerald with Kentucky Resource Council, in Virginia, a private attorney named Walt Morris, and many, many others. So it takes a village. Thank you all very much.
And Suncum is going to start having a water testing project that in conjunction with the Alliance for Appalachia's ACE project. And we will be doing some water testing on Dad's Creek
in Cumberland County
On Saturday.